Welcome to the fastest daf in town. Today, Masechtas Bava Metzia daf Pei Zayin. We are going to begin on Pei Zayin Amud Aleph, second half from the top. So we were contrasting Abraham to Lot, and here we continue, and it says as follows: that Amar Ksiv Echa Pas Lechem, they provided a little bit of bread. Uksiv El Habakar Ratz Abraham. So it's interesting that when Abraham spoke to these guests, these three angels, he only offered them a morsel of bread, but yet he ended up giving a whole lot of food. So on this, the famous Gemara, Amar Belazar, Mikanshat Sadikim Amar Mad V'Oisim Harbe. They say little and do much. Rishayim, on the other hand, Amar Harbe Filim Ad Ein Oisim. They say a lot, but they don't even do even the smallest amount. Manolim Ephraim. How do we see this? Mikar Ksiv, Eretz Arbamia Shekel, Kesef, 400 shekel. Usaim Ksiv, V'yishma Abraham El Ephraim, V'yishkal Abraham El Ephraim as a Kesef Shadira Basnim B'neiches, Arbamia Shekel Kesef, Oiver L'Soicher. So what exactly is Oiver L'Soicher? That it was such high value money that it could be used in all locations. It can be used in all situations. Deloi Shakel Mine Ella Kanteri, the ikaduchte the karile latikla kantera, which is the language of a shekel. These were high quality coins that were able to be brought from one place to the next. This is Rashi, Mishkal Gadol, Meyamana. Each coin was equivalent to 100. Okay, so again, we see from this the famous concept that a tzaddik will say very little, but they'll do so much. However, when it comes to people who are Rishayim, they do the opposite. They're big talkers, but they don't end up doing what they claim they're going to do. This is question TB13. So just look at the question. Heichem atzinu b'tarat tzadikim omrim ad v'oisim harbe, Rishayim omrim harbe filim ad enim oisim. So that's a pretty easy question. We know this from Sukkim, so that's sometimes they're nice and give us easy questions. Ksiv, the pasuk says by Abraham Kemach, Ksiv Silas. So how do we reconcile this? Now when it comes to the wife, they're a little bit more stingy, if you will, when it comes to giving, because she said, I'm only going to give Kemach flour, as opposed to Silas, which is a higher quality of flour. And it doesn't necessarily mean it in a negative way. So in those days, it was the man who was the provider. So the woman, because of her love for her husband, wouldn't feel comfortable giving more than that which she felt she was able to, and not knowing that her husband would necessarily be able to provide of the highest of quality, so she would offer less. However, the man who was the provider, so he was able to do these things. Ksiv lushi v'asi ugois. Ksiv v'yikach hamavachol v'verabakar yulechem lo'yisil kamayu. It's interesting. He promised them all this bread, but never delivered the bread. So Omer Ephraim Mikshaw Talmidu Shel Rabbi Meir. This is actually one of Rabbi Meir's students. He said to Mishmei Rabbi Meir, the name of his teacher Rabbi Meir, that Avraham Avinu eichel chulin b'taharahaya. That Avraham Avinu, when he even ate chulin, non-hektish food, even that was only with purity. But sorry, so she was involved in the challah. However, because she had seen for the first time, even though in old age, that she was in nida. So therefore, for that reason, this is what is the reason why no bread was provided. The Yomer Elamai sorry, wife, Yomer Hine, but she's in the tent. Well, idea sorry, menu senu haisa. So we'll know from here that she was modest. These three angels knew obviously where Sarah was. So what was the significance of asking a question and knew the answer to already? In order that there should be a higher degree of love between the husband and the wife. Says Rashi, she was more modest than other women. Normally you would have to ask, where's your wife? And it's possible she could be anywhere. But she was very modest. So it's very interesting. Even though you know what the answer is, it's important for a person to be able to speak nicely to a man or women friends to her, not to put down the husband, but on the contrary, to show a connection, to develop a relationship. So it's clearly a terrible, terrible anti-Torah thing for a person who is listening to, let's say, your friend making fun of his wife, or someone in himself making fun of his friend's wife. It's clearly wrong, because it's going to cause, potentially, that he's not going to care about his wife as much. And therefore, for that reason, we have to be extremely careful. Actually, the reason was that she should be able to receive the kosher bracha, and that will be part of the process of her being able to be blessed with a child. So, why is it these letters have dots on top of them in the Torah? So, that you should speak this way regarding your the wife of your the place where you're staying. You're not supposed to ask how women are doing. But to the husband you can. Then the pasuk says, so she was looking at herself, her physical being, that she was worn out. She says, how can I have a child? So Amar Chisda, Achar Shnivul Habasar, my body, my skin has wrinkled. Vrabu Hakematin, which again means there's a tremendous amount of wrinkles. This Adain Habasar, this Pashtu Hakematin, again it's been stretched out, these wrinkles. How is it possible that the beauty is going to come back? I've lost my beauty of a youthful woman, and therefore I'm also not capable of having a child. My husband's old. However, when Hashem said to Abraham, why did your wife laugh? She said that she was old. She didn't say that I think my husband's too old, even though her husband was 10 years older than her. That Hashem didn't respond to Abraham the way that actually Sarah thought. So however, Adaini Zaken, so as we see that Hashem didn't lie, but he deviated from the absolute language of what Sarah said in order to be able to create peace. There was no need to have to say something if you know it's going to cause problems. But timer mi milel la Abraham hanika bonim Sarah. So kama bonim hanika Sarah. What do you mean it says bonim? We know that Sarah had one child, Yitzchak. So what does it mean that she had bonim? Which sounds more than one. So Rav Levi Yisa Hayom Shigam Abraham as Yitzchak. But no, the day in which she weaned Yitzchak, but no, Asa Suda Gedoyla. It was a big meal. Hayukolim as Oilim Irandim Yamrim Reisim Zakin Uzakena Sheheviu Sufi Minashuk. This is probably not their child. They probably had an adopted child, a child who was abandoned, and that's who it is. There's no way that this woman could potentially have had a child like this. The Amrim Benenu, and they're saying it's their child. So they're making this big party to try to convince people that it's their child. So Me'asa, Abraham Avinu Holach V'zimin Kol Gedol Hador V'sar Yemenu Zimnoes Nishay Sehem. So they gathered all the men. Sarah gathered up the women. All the women brought their own children. And she nursed those babies herself. Sarah was able to nurse other babies to prove that in fact she was able to produce milk, which obviously means, even though she's old, that she was able to probably also have this child. And her breasts were like fountains. They all nursed. The people were still coming up with stuff. Yomim Imsar Habas Tishim Shana Taylor, she's 90. Abraham ben Mea Shana Yoel, he's 100. Ya Nepach Klas der Panim Shal Yitzchak Venidbal Havram Pasku Klum Abraham Yeholad Yitzchak. Hashem made that Yitzchak looked exactly like his father Abraham, even though they were 100 years apart, but they had almost identical features, and therefore it was clear that this was Abraham's child. Of course, the interesting thing is people doubted Abraham, and even Sarah said, how could my husband's old? He ended up having Ishmael when he was 86 years old, and no one talks about that. It's an interesting question. So Ad Abraham lo hayazikna. So up until Abraham, apparently there was no such thing as being old. Anyone who wanted to come to Abraham, mishtoi bahadi Yitzchak, they were going to go to Yitzchak. Bahadi Yitzchak, mishtoi bahadi Abraham. They couldn't figure out who was who because they literally looked like twin brothers. So Asa Abraham bo rachmi b'havi zikna. So Hashem gave rachmim that Abraham should be old. Very interesting. So becoming old is not a curse. It's actually an element of a blessing. Hashem shows rachmim, that a person should not be viewed as a little child, as a 20-year-old, as someone who has no life experience. No, there's an element of kavod you have to give someone because of the experiences that they have in their life. And therefore, it's actually a rachmim that a person becomes old. It shows people that this person has lived a certain amount of life, and therefore have to show them a greater level of respect. Shnemar, Bava Zaken Baba Yomi. Ad Yaakov lo havi chulsha. Interesting enough, until Yaakov there was no one sick. Thus Yaakov borach me v'havi chulsha. Yaakov asked for mercy, and he became sick. Shnemar b'yomel Yosef hine avicha chayla. Your father is sick. Ad Yasa Elisha. Because what would happen, as it's explained, is that people would just, says Rashi, it gives a person an opportunity to be able to give their last words and to be able to organize and arrange their household belongings and to create a will for their children. But if you're just going to die suddenly, it's a problem. So it's interesting. Sickness is actually a blessing on some level because it gives you an opportunity to recognize your mortality and therefore your ability to then be able to share with your children that which you think is important, not just your finances, but also blessings, your advice, etc. So Adios Elisha, until Elisha came around, lo havi decholish v'itzbach. No one was sick and got healed. As Elisha barach me v'itzbach. But Elisha caused someone who was sick to get healed. Shnemer v'Elisha choles chalia v'asher yomos bo. V'chlal dechol choli achriti. Okay. It sounded like that there was another sickness. Okay, Taraban. Shloisha chaloim chol Elisha. There was 3 sicknesses of Elisha. Echad shedach boy l'gechazi b'shtei yadav. One which was pushed away to Gechazi with 2 hands. Ve'echad shigira duvim betinaikis. One is when he was incited bears with children. Ve'echad shemeis boy, and when he actually died. Shnemer v'Elisha choles chalia v'asher yomos boy. Okay. Let's see if there's any Rashi here. Okay. If, let's say, going back to our Mishnah, all the way at the beginning of the parak, that if the malacha wasn't done yet, they didn't start working, you can say, I'm only going to give you bread and some beans, and that's it. Does it say bread which is made out of lentils? O pas vikitnius tanan. Do you have to provide lentils and bread? So Amrle Halokim Srichavav Kimardia Deliboyus. She says, Elokim, which is like a Lashon Shvua, we need a vav just like a piece of wood to a stick. So what does that mean? It says Rashi, Shem HaNahar Mordya. Actually, the name of a river, that's the name of a river. Eitz Sharav HaChayvil Manhig Boy Hasvina L'Rachaka Min HaVanim Min HaMachshalim. Okay. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Aimer Enu Sarach Kol Kiminig Medina. Just do whatever the custom is. So Akuli Suma, what does that come to include? Sui how did not. Hasayich Hasapayol, your hire workers, V'Armelo Ke'echad V'Kishnayim Imnei Ir. Like one or like two in this city. Noisin Lo Kepachais Shebaschirus. You can then give the minimum wage. Then that would be acceptable. It says Rashi, Hari Schar Chalai, your wages is ke'echem mepwali ir. Dev Rabbi Yeshua, Reb Chom Omrim Mishamnin b'neihem. You have to give the middle salary. Says Rashi, a little bit pachas, a little bit yoser. El k'minei medina beininus. You should give the average salary. Okay, let's look at question 9. So Rabbi Shimon Omer Hakol K'minei Medina Ma Moisef Rabbi Shimon Omer Ba'amru Hakoil. So Sha'af im Hiskru Lo Bahal Bayas. Even if he mentioned Ke'echad Ukashnayim Imnei Ir, like one or two of the people in the city, nice and committing a Medina Habeinani. You have to give the middle amount. Okay. So let's see the next mission. It says the Masnisim. Ve'elu oichlin min atayra. So these are people, these are the workers that are allowed to eat. While they're engaged in working on the field, they're allowed to eat the food that they're working with from the Torah. Anything that's attached to the ground. B'shas gamar malacha, at the time that it is completed, and basically they're harvesting it, they're detaching it, or with tolish min akark, if you have stuff that's detached from the ground, ad shel nigmar malachtai, and it's not yet completed. Nigmar malacha, Rashi says, is la meiser, is the chiv of having to give meiser. So if it hasn't been completed yet in its growth, it's not gemar malacha, or it's the growth because it's tolish, but you haven't completed the process. For example, it says v'im bar chalahu. If it's for chala, actually nigma malachto chala. So it has to be ready for the separation of chala. So until then, even though it's tolish, you can eat it then. If a davar shegidulim in the arts, it has to be something that grows from the ground. These things you cannot eat, even though you're working there. Something which is still attached to the ground as we continue to pay Zayin with Beis, at the time when it's not completed. If it's detached, it's already completed. Or something that does not grow from the ground. So it says Rashi, when you're like weeding onions. Okay, let's now the Gemara is going to explain. So how do we know? Says Rashi, how do we know that a worker is allowed to eat the fruits and food that he's engaged in if it's attached to the ground? The pasuk, you go into your friend's vineyard and you eat. That's what the pasuk says. And Rashi says, that you cannot put the food into your basket, like when it comes to, for example, all you can eat. You can eat whatever you want there, but you can't take any of it home. It says Rashi, it's got to go into your Baal Bayas's kli. Alma b'shas kamar moleches chiborin koi. It's mashma that we're talking about. It's already completed. Ashkan, Karen, I can understand by a vineyard called Mili Minolan. How do we know any other food? So I'm giving him Karen. Makar miyucha davar shigudul karka. Vineyard, all this, the grapes grow up from the ground. B'shas kamar malacha poyol eichel boy. And when it's complete, you can eat from it. Av kol davar shigudul karka b'shas kamar malacha poyol eichel boy. So that's when you're allowed to eat it. So mal Karen shechein chai ba'oilus. Maybe the only reason why we allow you to do this is because there's a chiyuv of oilus, which is one of the chiyuvim of separating grapes. So maybe only theirs are a chiyuv to make sure the poil can eat these things. So gamrin and makama, we learn it actually from standing grain. Kama gufa manon. How do we know about standing grain that they can consume that? Taksiv kisaba becomes rayacha. When you go to your friend's field, and you end up engaging in the removal of the various sheaves in their field. So maybe the reason why is because there's a chiv chal over there. So maybe that's the reason why, says Rashi, who aimer hakar bepesach shehu bamin hasoirin shechayim b'chala. So mamai dehai kama namachayavas b'chalahi. How do we know that this is talking about the grain that is chayim b'chala? Dilma kol kama rachmana. Maybe it's just talking about any form of vegetation, like for example, even let's say rice. So asik kama ksiv hacha kisab b'kamas reyacha ksiv hasam. The pasuk says mihachel chermish b'kama. Like you use a sickle. Ma hasam kama de mechayim b'chala av hacha nami kama de mechayim b'chala. So maybe again the reason why maybe we have this din by a poil, there's all these extra laws about poil because there's extra din of chala. So how do we know that it applies to other things too? So yeah, but maybe again the only reason why you're chayiv is because you're chayiv in chala. So kerem yochiach. Kerem is not chayiv in chala, and yet still there's an obligation to provide for the worker, and he can't put into his kalim. So malakam shechen chayiv ba'oilus. Maybe the reason why there's these dinim by the vineyard is because it also has the other obligation of oilus. So kama yotaychet, there's no din oilus by kama. So b'chazor din. Morizeh kurizeh sada shamashim. What is the common denominator? Shechein davar shigdul karka, the things that grow from a karen or kama, they grow in the ground. And while at the gemar malacha, at that time they could eat it. So we have a sada shava. Yeah, but mal sada shava shehen yesh behem sad mizbeach. Sounds very much like the 6 parak in brachos. Nami, once there, you can also bring in a zayas. These be sad mizbeach. So then, at least maybe the din of olives also, because there's sad mizbeach. Of course, the notion of having the menorah, oils, etc. Okay, as well as for the mincha, the zayis b'mat sad osi, who goofy kerem ikri. So it's called a kerem. Dechsev v'yivar migadish v'yad akama v'yad kerem zayis. So it's already called a kerem zayis. So Omer Rapapa kerem zayis ikri kerem stabel ikri. It's not called a kerem. So mikol makim kasha. So you still have again the kasha that we see that maybe there's exceptions as to when the din the poil can eat these things is because it has other laws, but maybe not a regular other foods that grow. El Omer Shmuel Omer Kra the chermesh, the pasuk talking about the sickle, l'rabos kol bali chermesh, anything that's cut. V'hai chermesh meboyele b'shas chermesh eichel. That only time you can do it is at the time of the gemar malacha, at the end. Shelo b'shas chermesh v'oseichel. But if it's not at that time, the workers cannot eat. Now, we went out from don't put it into your kalim. Then why does it say that? Again, it's mashma. You can't put it into your kalim, but you could still eat it. So tenach davar chermesh tolabar chermesh menolan. Not every food is cut with a sickle. So how do you include that? The workers could eat those. El Rabbi Yitzchak Amar Kra kama. But Ralbas kol bali koim. Anything that's standing up. Ibo ha'amrit kama de b'chayvim b'chala. Maybe it's only things that are standing which require chala, a chiv of separating chala. So hanimili mikameden esi chermesh. That's before we came up with this drasha. Hashi asa chermesh is sarabuli kol davar chermesh. We said anything that uses a sickle. Yavagav dolim b'chayim b'chala. Even things that are obviously there's no chiv of chala. So therefore, kamalomali urabas kol bali koima. So once you already have chermesh to include anything that you cut with a sickle, so then koma can include things that are even without a sickle. Okay. Since we went up from these 2 psukim, so then kisava become reachel lamali. So what's the whole purpose of this pasuk? So Amar Rabbi lehil chalisav. It's to tell you it's oin halachas. Kedesanya kisavo. When it says when you go into the field, never can be but never lahawan lo savo love hashemesh. It says the sun shouldn't go down. So what is this connection? So we learn out Mal halan b'poyel hakasam adaber Rav Khan b'poyel kasam adaber. They're both talking about workers. Just like you have to pay your worker, so too you have your workers allowed to eat the food. So b'kerem ri'echa, what does it learn out from b'kerem ri'echa? And this is going to be question 10, TA 13, TB 14. Your friend's field. V'lo b'kerem kusi. The dinim do not apply to a kerem kusi. What is that? Says Rashi, when it says kerem ri'echa v'el kilyecha lo titein, that you cannot put food into your kli and take it home, that doesn't apply to a kerem of a nachri, which means that not only can you eat, if you're working the field of a nachri, you could also put it into your kli. Now, apparently that sounds almost like you're stealing because you're taking stuff for yourself beyond your workload. Now, I can understand who says that in general you can't steal. That's why we're being lenient over here. The pasuk needs to say, yeah, you're not allowed to steal, but in this case, this is an exception because he's a worker. Why need a pasuk by a poil that he's allowed to do it if you can? Any person can steal. So it's telling you that the only person, even if you're working a field, it's only if it's chulin food. But if it's hektish, you're not allowed to eat it at all. So that's the second drasha. Yechalta, you can eat it as v'lo moitzeitz anavim. You can't squeeze out and suck out the juices of the grapes. V'lo anavim b'davar acher. And also it says you can't have grapes and something else. It's Rashi, litbol anavim b'melach, to dip it into salt to make it easier for you to eat more. You can eat the thing, but you can't have dips and stuff like that. Kinafshachat, like your soul. Kinefeshel balbayas, just like the owner of the field. Kach nafshashel poyel, so too the person who's working. What's that? Ma nafshacha oichel upater, just like you yourself are allowed to eat it. If this is your field, and you're pater from meiser, because as we said, the lo nigmor molachtoi lo meiser, because it hasn't completed yet. Because the only time there's a chiyuv by grapes is only when it goes into the pit. So so too when it comes to the worker, we say the same thing, and it's not a problem. He's allowed to eat these things. Savecha, you're allowed to eat it until you're satiated. It's just because you're able to eat doesn't mean you should just be eating like a madman. So again, it's like you have an all-you-can-eat buffet. That doesn't mean you should eat until you're sick. That much you're not allowed to do. They'll kill yachalotit and put into your kalim. At the time in which you're putting stuff into the balabayas's kli, because you're harvesting for him, then ata oichel, then you can eat. However, if you're not putting anything into the balabayas's kli, then you're not allowed to eat either. Okay, we're going to stop there. Question 10. Ki savoi b'kerem riacha. So manilban midaksiv riacha. So the one who says gezel akum is aser, it's the mater poil shel kusi litain el kelyecha. You can put into your kli. The one who says gezel akum is muter, aser you to eat. A poil cannot eat that of hektish. Let's just see if there's a different question. Question TA 13 says mama matin mikerem riacha umazet taloi. Again, it's taloi on whether you hold that gezel akum is muter aser. And same thing, kisam riacha manilman midachsev riacha is riacha v'loi nachri riacha v'loi shel hektish atkan.